basically, decisions that the player can make. But this could be, very specific. Like it might be, oh, I'm going to use this specific ability, but it could also be kind of like broad. This isn't. This is mostly just a way of thinking about why, like how the value of certain things the player can do changes over time in response to what they did previously. So, and then as far as it being loops, the reason why it's a loop is, I mean, it's based on the feedback loop. It's you have like, I guess probably going into examples would be helpful, but essentially, you start with say you have like 5 actions or something, and maybe at the start they each have like a value of like a value quit of 1, and then if you do something, maybe it decreases the value of that specific action. So if you use action A, now it has a value of like 0.5 or something. So its relative value to the other options has decreased. Or in a different example, you could have it be that it increases to like 1.5, and now relative to the other options, it's increased.
Yeah.
Or it doesn't change, right? So the reason it's like a loop is that this happens over and over and over, right? It's more of like a property of the system, if that makes sense. I mean, I don't know how well that explains like why I call them loops, because I know there's like a little bit of, because we each had a little bit about this in text, and that was one of the things that kind of confused people, was like, why are they loops?
Yeah, so it's like in general, like your actions affect game state, and then game state affects your future choices,
Yeah,
right? Your future actions you're gonna take. So it's just
yeah,
like, so it kind of feels similar to like a feedback loop. But I do
yeah,
think like I think do think it's good that you separated it a little bit from feedback loops and stuff, because as you're saying, like often when you choose one choice, it makes it like uh, it makes it so that that is like relatively better or worse than other choices, but often like that's not really like kind of like the sort of feedback loops you think of, where of like like temperature changes or cars rolling down hills, or like it's not it's just like the difference between them are changing, but the thing itself might not be, if that makes sense. I'm not
yeah,
sure if I put it right, but I think
yeah,
that's kind
So
of
I
like
think
the
what
difference.
might be good to do is like maybe just before we get into the details, like step back and like kind of what are we trying to kind of establish here? Like or what problem are we trying to solve? Like, or what are we trying to explore in a more
sure,
broad way, just to kind of contextualize these details a bit more?
yeah, yeah. I think that the main thing I would like to try to explore is what the kind of like strengths and weaknesses of the different types are, because I think that like if you kind of can understand, like, well, yeah, I think if you can understand what each of them are good at and what each of them might create issues with, then like you can use that to better inform um, your
Yeah,
usage of them,
right.
Yeah.
intentional or not, in the games you make. That's kind of the main goal
Okay.
I'd like to
Yeah.
try to explore.
Okay, yeah. So just clarifying about like it is as like a game design lens, because I think they're also useful as just a game playing lens as well. Like as someone who plays a lot of games, I recognize these things,
Hmm.
and it like helps me like play the games better.
So maybe we could come up with like 2 or 3 examples of a reinforcing, neutral, and diversifying, just so that people have where we
Sure.
sort of have like a little bit more of a concrete idea, of those kinds of things in our heads.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah, for sure.
okay, so what are some
So
reinforcing ones?
yeah, I think one of the main ones that comes to mind. Well, there's a few, right? Um, so like in a RTS or something, maybe you want to create. This is kind of I don't know. I'll go with it, right? So in an RTS, maybe you have you like are gonna make some barracks or something to train some units, and essentially like the first unit you train is actually kind of like really expensive because you have to build the barracks and then you have to train them.
Okay.
But then like each subsequent unit you train is kind of like in a sense cheaper than the last because like you're distributing the cost of the barracks, right?
Okay.
Whereas like if you want to like have a whole bunch of different units, then like you have to build like all these different buildings or something, right?
Yeah.
So
That's when I would just call like opportunity cost to changing strategies, this sort of thing is kind of the word I would use for that.
Okay, opportunity cost.
Yeah, I have a few examples too.
Sure, please.
So like similarly with the opportunity cost, like in Balatro, like if you have a level 10 2-pair, then the opportunity cost of like picking one of the other planets just increases. Like the more you have chosen one planet and one hand type to go for, the higher the opportunity cost of switching to a different one.
Yeah.
So that's like a reinforcing loop. And then
Tribes in an auto battler.
Yeah, exactly. And then Dark Twinge a couple days ago mentioned in Brotato there's like these damage reduction or dodge chance. And so the way it works is as your damage reduction or dodge chance approaches 100%, it is increasingly like more and more valuable, right? Like if you go from 0% dodge chance to 10%, that's like a 10% increase of effective hit points. But if you go from 80% to 90%, that's a 50% increase in effective hit points. And so that's one that comes up really very frequently in a lot of games, usually like dodge chance, damage reduction. Sometimes attack speed works that way when it counts down. Cooldown reduction often works that way. Resistances, that sort of.
So there's a non-linear sort of curve, I guess.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Another example is like in a lot of, I think in Slay the Spire and some other games, there's like poison where it becomes more effective. It has like more effective. It's dealing more effective damage the higher the poison is already. So, like if you
Can you restate that? I'm not sure I follow.
Yeah. So there you can have like a game where you're fighting an enemy, you apply 3 poison to them, and then so that's effectively going to do like 3 + 2 + 1 damage. So it's going to do 6 damage. But if they had like 5 poison already, and then you dealt 3 poison damage, then that's going to do like, what is it? 8 + 7 + 6. So it's going to do like a lot more effective damage.
Okay.
So
becomes so poison becomes more deadly the more there is of it, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's like. I think one final example I'll give, mostly because I think this is going to be relevant when we start talking about strengths and weaknesses, is in Hades, where a lot of the upgrades are kind of just making in various ways, or just making like your different abilities stronger. It kind of becomes the case that you largely just want to make 1 or maybe 2 abilities like really powerful and then kind of ignore the others, because in that game, like you're basically going to be doing one of your attacks at a time. Like you can't be doing multiple attacks at a time. So it kind of like makes sense to just make one of them really, really good.
Path of Exile is like very like that, where you just
Sure.
want to like really go all in on one ability.
Yeah.
Okay.
So did we want to move on to neutral loops or diversifying loops?
Let's do diversifying and then neutral.
Sure. Yeah. So as the name implies, diversifying loops are generally about getting the player to, or they encourage the player to use a lot of different actions, right? So I have a whole bunch of examples. Let me see what the best ones would be. I'll start with RO, and so in there's like a lot of games that have what I was calling bundled faucets, where there's some kind of resource that is refreshed in some way, but when it's refreshed, other separate resources are also refreshed. So in Oro, when you step on the like rune tiles, I forget what they're called. They like refresh.
Power tiles.
Yeah, the power tiles. They refresh like all of your abilities, right? So if you like you could just use one ability if you wanted, but then you're kind of like wasting
Mm-hmm.
the other abilities, right? So and like the same thing is kind of in Deep Rock Galactic, where like you resupply and it resupplies all your different ammunitions. We see some other examples. So
I guess like a mana system in an RPG that like you sleep at the inn and it refills all your mana whether you've used any or not. Would that be an example of that? Or like, you know what I mean? Like even if 3 of your guys have full mana, I don't know if that counts. That's a good maybe clarifying question.
well, yeah, okay. So maybe what would make sense in that case is like with a lot of squad tactics, like XCOM, for instance. You know, each of your units has their own like AP. So it's not like chess where you can just keep on like moving the same character over and over.
Mm-hmm.
You know, using all of your units in that case. I don't know if that's kind of what you were getting at with because you mentioned the resting, but then you mentioned like multiple characters, so I assume maybe like they each had their own like reserves of mana in that case.
Yeah, they do. Yeah. In like a typical RPG, every character has their own mana meter, and so maybe one character has no mana and everyone else is full, and you can stay at the inn and it'll fill everyone's mana, regardless of how. It sounds a lot like the Deep Rock Galactic example that you gave.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that sounds like the XCOM sort of AP, but yeah, same sort of idea.
Sure.
So you know, one way to do it is like bundle faucets. Another way is to have you know, actual just straight up diminishing returns. So these are games where like if you do an action, it becomes more expensive to do in the future. One thing that it's got to exist somewhere, but I couldn't find an example of it, was some sort of like supply and demand economy thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think this maybe exists in Off-World Trading Company.
Yeah, probably. Those kinds of games, like economic kind of games, yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, if you like just make a whole bunch of like one item and you sell it, like its value is going to drop.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like you're kind of better off diversifying, like, oh, I'm going to make a bunch of different stuff and then sell like a little bit of each. But
yeah, that's pretty common in like multiplayer games anyway.
sure.
Actually, I had a question. A thing like this, and I wonder how this would play into this loop system, if at all. In Super Smash Brothers, every time you use a move, that move becomes less powerful over time for a while. So, what kind of loop would that be, if any?
Yeah, I mean that would be a diversifying loop for sure.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty clear example.
Is that because your other moves are relatively speaking more powerful than this move?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think the important thing about this is that it's about the relative value of other actions compared to, or like the relative value comparison of this action to other actions. Is it increasing, decreasing, or staying the same?
Yeah, that's a good definition, I think, actually.
Yeah, it's about how it's going to affect player decisions, right? So,
yeah.
Assuming a player is, you know, trying to win.
Okay, that's cool. So let me just so really quickly, like reinforcing action. So I do now think maybe that the word loop might not be necessary here. But in any case, the reinforcing an action means to make it more powerful as opposed to your other available actions. Whereas diversifying means you are diminishing the value of this action versus the other available actions. Is that about the sort of like the core of the concept?
I mean, I would include relative in the definition.
Yes. That's what I mean.
Because, you know, you could make it, you might not actually be diminishing the value of something. You could just make it that the other things are becoming more valuable in various ways. So, you know, one example of that is like various versions of set collection. So like a basic example of this would be like a crafting system where if you're trying to make something, you know, you need a bunch of object A and a bunch of object B and a bunch of object C. Like doing more of stuff to get a ton of object A isn't going to help you. Like
And
you
so
need
which kind of action is this then?
well, this would be diversifying because you're not really benefited by just doing a bunch of stuff that gives you item A. You have to
Okay.
kind of do the stuff to get A, B, and C.
Hmm.
But you can have there's some other examples for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a couple examples of
Yeah.
diversifying. Okay, so one of the ones that I think is super common is like itemization in games. And so like in like a game like Diablo or League of Legends, you often like buy equipment that will like increase your stats. And it's important to know that if your stats are increasing linearly, then every subsequent increase of the same quantity is like relatively less valuable. So for example, if you do 100 damage and then you buy a sword that gives you another 100 damage, you're doubling your damage. But then if you get another 100 damage, you're now only increasing by 50%, right? And then if
Right.
you buy another 100 damage, now it's only like 33%. And so in games like this, it's usually good to diversify your item choices. So like if you buy a sword that doubles your damage, and then instead of buying another 100 damage, you now buy a sword that doubles your attack speed. Now you're doing 4 times as much damage instead of 3 times as much damage. And so that's a diversifying loop. And that also applies to like a bunch of other stats into as well, like health and stuff. If you think of like effective output of a character, doubling your health will also double your damage because you'll just survive twice as long, right?
So I have a question about that. So in this case, when we're talking about, let's say Diablo, we're talking about your attack damage, right? Couldn't the case be made that that if so you could add the 100 damage extra sword or whatever, but then you said like, well, but you could also sort of diversify by increasing your attack speed. But couldn't that be said to be a reinforcing action?
Yeah.
Because that's actually making the action of attacking better, right?
Yeah.
Or
yeah, so you can bundle them different ways.
okay.
Like I could say you could group or bundle like the damage things into like certain groups. It kind of depends how you wanna look at it.
Okay.
I think the main thing, and actually I want to circle back to this at some point, is going back to the Hades example. In Hades, basically if you're doing attack A, you're not doing attack B or C. If you're doing attack B,
Right.
you're not doing attack A or C. Whereas I think in Diablo, a lot of they kind of have a pretty I mean, a lot of that's based on like cooldowns and stuff, and I think cooldowns are an example, a pretty prominent example of diversifying loops. Maybe to the extreme. I think both
they're forcing them.
Yeah,
I
think both the cooldowns and the Hades example I want to get back to, because I think these are kind of like some of the extremes where like you should probably be aware of them. It sounds like someone's going to say something though. So.
Oh yeah. I was just going to say, I think I can sort of square the circle on this Diablo attack speed thing. Maybe what we might say is that because in Diablo, let's say you have two different types of action. Action one is I'm buying an item at the shop, and I'm that's one sort of sphere, and then action two is I'm attacking, right? And so from the perspective of the attacking action, getting more attack speed might be a reinforcing action. However, from the perspective of the purchasing an item, being in the shop, maybe that's a diversifying thing because you're getting a different stat. Does that make sense? To like, does that make sense?
Yeah.
I think maybe the way I would explain the Diablo example would be to say, like, you have a game with cooldowns or whatever, so you're basically gonna be doing all your different actions at some general set amount. And if you have different options to upgrade your different abilities, and if one of them is like, if you're just trying to upgrade the one but it has like diminishing returns, I don't know if I would say the example of like adding, let's say this, right? Maybe it increases your damage by 100 each time, but the cost keeps increasing, right? So it's like the first time it costs like 10 gold, and then it costs like 20, and then 30, and so on. If you can like increase the damage of your other abilities for a less cost that has like more gain, that's going to be
Mhm.
more of a diversifying loop.
Okay.
Whereas if there's not,
Whereas
then
attack
it's
speed is what, in your opinion?
well, I guess it depends because I mean, is attack speed like affecting everything or just affecting one ability?
Just for the purpose of this question, it's just affecting your attack. So you have your attack damage, right? Let's say it's a game where that's all you have. You just have an attack, you know, or yeah, you just have an attack and you're increasing the attack speed. Is that reinforcing? I think it is, even though it's a different stat. As
Okay.
opposed
I
to,
think I understand what you're saying.
yeah,
You're asking if you just have an attack, but there's different things you can change. You can change like, oh, you can upgrade how much damage it does, or versus
sure.
how often it happens. So this is kind of like the multiplication thing where, yeah. So I mean, if you have two numbers that sum to like 10 or something, it's gonna be better. It's gonna be best to have it be like 5 and 5 as opposed to like 1 and 9.
Sure.
If you want like Mac, I don't know if
Yeah.
that's what you're asking. That's kind of
So would
the
you
read I got.
say it's a diversifying or reinforcing by
Well, I mean that
attack
would be
speed?
diversifying.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's what I would say as well. Like let's say you're playing League of Legends and you're just auto attacking, you don't have any other abilities.
Okay,
Like it's better, like the best thing you can do is to buy attack and then buy attack speed and then buy HP and then buy armor and MR. Like you want a bit of everything. And so
sure.
that's kind of how I see that. But one interesting thing is that if you're playing a team game, um, you do kind of want if you can guarantee that the tank takes all the damage before a DPS, you actually do want the tank to only buy defensive items and the DPS to only buy uh,
Yeah,
DPS items, and then you can kind of create your own little like super unit of like two people kind of combining into like one, if that
Mm-hmm.
makes kind of sense. And
Yep.
in that case, you are grouping the attack and the attack DPS items kind of in its own little group, and then like and so in that sense you're kind of like reinforcing that group
for
within
sure.
the DPS character. So you can like look at it a few different ways. um but and then so
Yeah,
like within that group you're diversifying, but you are like reinforcing that group of choices. So
for sure. Yeah, I think I don't know if it makes sense to talk about now or not, but one thing is that you definitely can have multiple of these loops going on at once, as you're talking about. And I actually think that um, in a lot of cases, some of the more interesting decisions are when you have these conflicts between different
yeah,
types of things going
definitely.
on. Going back to the Deep Rock Galactic example, one that I like there is there's a one of the characters has a minigun, and basically the minigun, you know, it becomes most powerful if you're continuously using it. But you know, in the sense of like you're getting the other ammos, so um, you know, you have to like continuously fire, which is gonna like kind of commit you to using it almost. It doesn't commit you to using it, but otherwise you're kind of wasting some ammo. But it's gonna be like kind of best when it's like about to overheat because it's doing like extra damage and like setting enemies on fire and stuff.
Mhm.
But yeah, there's like a lot of cases where you could have this conflict of for the player between should I use this other thing because right now it's like in a sense more valuable, but this one kind of becomes more valuable if I keep using it. But then like there's a lot of more ambiguity, right? So
Okay. Yeah, cool. So let's move on to neutral action loops. What are these? How do these work? I guess I would
yeah,
guess it's the
so
relative action of this action, relative value stays the same, or
yeah, yeah.
okay,
So roughly, and this is more like a broad picture kind of thing. It's not like the specific example that this is always going to be neutral
sure.
or like whatever. It's just like in general, like an aggregate.
Hmm.
So you know, common examples of this would be like a lot of JRPGs where you know you have various actions you can do, and you know you have some like shared resource or something that you use to spend on them. So you can like you have like option A, option B, option C. You spend some mana on them, and then you can spend mana on them again, or this is like very like opportunity cost sort of stuff. So it's just like, oh, if I'm doing this attack, then I'm not doing this other attack, or whatever, right? You can just keep spamming the same thing if you want, or you could change it up. You could do a bunch of different stuff. There's not really any. There are other reasons why you're doing stuff, right? Like this again. This is only one lens to look at like why certain actions are valuable or less valuable. Like we haven't even mentioned stuff like the context, which is probably one of the most important things of like why you're using one action instead of another action. And there's also just like action funnels and like, oh, there's only a certain set of actions you can even do right now, whether that's just through randomness or through, how the context is changing. Yeah. So
what are some examples of neutral actions, neutral action loops?
Yeah. So I would give the like JRPGs very often are examples of that, where using an action, it's just gonna be available again like right away, and you have like shared resources that you're spending on like multiple different things.
So maybe like attacking using an attack in a JRPG, because like if you cast a spell, if it costs mana, then actually I would say like in a way there is a diversifying thing, because that spell you can cast fewer times, so like it's sort of more valuable in a sense. Whereas the other ones, or wait, no, that's if you had mana. That's wrong. That's if you had like spells per day. But if you have a mana system, yeah, I'm trying to think. Like, I guess it would attacking with characters in a JRPG be a neutral?
It depends.
Value?
Like it's gonna depend.
Okay.
Maybe we'll go to like use a specific example, like in XCOM, where you have action points, like everything, like basically each turn. I don't know. Maybe are there examples of do any of the actions in XCOM have like cooldowns or anything, or like is it just like you spend the cost and then
I think there are cooldowns for sure, but so I want to throw this idea out there that I feel like it might be the possibility. I'm not sure, but my first thought when I'm trying to think of neutral things is that this probably doesn't exist. Like this probably like, or if it exists, it's like we could get really granular and we would see like, actually this is subtly reinforcing, or it's subtly diversifying. Like because everything in a game almost always, I'm trying to think of, maybe I'm happy to be wrong on this, but everything seems like it changes the state in such a way that, at least in a subtle way, there's going to be a reinforcing or diversifying effect. Is that wrong?
I mostly agree. I think like the games are complicated enough that like it's almost always going to affect game state in one way or the other. But there are a couple examples, and they're basically ones where like the state resets. So like for example, like let's say you are in a JRPG against an enemy that has only like 1 HP left. You can attack that enemy with any sort of ability. It'll kill it. It'll go to the next state, and that state is identical no matter like which attack you use, as long as you're not using mana or whatever. So anything that kind of like changes, like that has like a big state change or reset after like or like if you're playing like a round of a fighting game and you can attack, you can kill the opponent with like many different abilities. It kind of doesn't matter which one you pick, but that's like those are kind of edge cases, and like that's all I can really think of. Actually, like in general, I think like
right, and it's sort of actually it feels like that's not even like the reinforcing, like the action loop is just not getting measured. Actually, is almost what it feels like, because the game is, in a sense, the game is ending, right? And like so the looping effect has stopped, and that's the only reason that we're calling it neutral. It's not that. So I think if we want to find a neutral, we can't use a state reset example. We have to use an example where yes, I chose an action, and now all of this action and all my other actions, the relative value of them has not changed. Or, we don't have to be super sticklers about it. These things have very, very subtly changed. And I would say, I feel like if I was working on a game and I found a thing and I was like, this action that I let players take, it did not reinforce or diversify in these ways very strongly at all, I would then try to redesign that thing, because it sounds like it's bad. So I would say that neutral, if they exist, like I think we as game designers inherently are trying to design away any existing examples of neutral things. And also I think it would be kind of like counterintuitive almost to put them in your game, because you'd have to do like some weird stuff. Like, you know, I feel like we'd have to, I think, like, let's think through it and see if we can come up with some examples, but I feel like we would have to specifically design an ability in order to, like, that specifically is there to not reinforce or diversify, maybe, but I might be wrong. That's just my sense.
I think that neutral loops are probably more common in more like actiony you know, real-time types of games than they are in turn-based or like tabletop games. That's my guess, and I think that's for a few reasons. I think part of it is that some of the challenges that come with the other things is that they add complexity to the state, and if you're like have some fast-paced game, there's like all these things you have to keep track of. There's like you try to do something, then you can't do it, but you can do other stuff, and I think it's less overhead for the player to keep in mind, I think that's probably one of the main reasons why they're common. I think I would agree that of the three that we were talking about, they're probably the ones that you would. I don't know if I want to say that you want to always avoid them, but I think that they do tend to be some of the least interesting, and they have some issues. But you know,
so when you're talking about like, action games, can you sort of talk about that a bit more? What's an example? What's coming to mind for you?
Yeah, so I don't know, like say you have a Zelda-like sort of game, and like you know you can do a light attack, you can do a heavy attack, you can dodge, or you can do some other thing, and you know you can just spam any of these if you want, and it's like a lot of it is just figuring out, okay, well, based on the context, right now I should do a heavy attack. Or right now I should dodge. Or right now I should blah blah blah.
But in the realm of a Zelda fight, like so we're looking at like, you know, Link versus some, you know, Minotaur or whatever, and in the realm of that, like I think in the broader realm of the game, like maybe we don't really care so much about these details, but within the realm of that fight, of that little battle, I think that we would see that like, oh, I've done a heavy attack, and so now that has changed the value of, you know, like, because that's committed me in a direction. There's a cooldown. There's you know, like a timing cooldown. There's all these little subtle things that change the state, that change the equations for what's valuable and what's not valuable.
No, I agree with that. Okay. I think the main point I'm kind of getting at is I'm talking about in aggregate. It's not like this specific example. It's like in general, if I do a heavy attack, is that going to make it more likely for me to do the other things or not? And I think in a lot of those cases, with like the Zelda example, there's not going to be that much of a, like there might be something very, very subtle, but it's probably going to be pretty subtle.
Well, if you do a heavy attack, then you've done, let's say you hit them and you've done significant damage. Yeah, okay, I see what you're saying. That's yeah, there might be some subtle ways in which that reinforces something or diversifies, but it's pretty subtle. But I also feel like this would maybe be a grounds for critique of the Zelda combat system, at least from the perspective of looking at it like, you know, like some what we're sort of fundamentally doing here is we're sort of looking at systems as though they're strategy games, because we're talking about the valuation, the power valuation of various actions that players can take. And of course, in many video games, I think Zelda is one of them, that's not really what players are thinking about a lot of the time. You know, they're kind of in a completely different realm. They're thinking more along the lines of, you know, the fantasy simulation and like just aesthetic action and kinetic sort of, you know, the feel and all the game feel and all these sorts of things. And so but to the extent that, yeah, like if we are looking at Zelda as like kind of a strategy game, which I think that's what these are about. They're about valuation, right?
Yeah.
Then we would say Zelda does have some kind of relatively neutral, you know, like fighting in Zelda has a lot of this neutral sort of stuff, and let's revisit the design so that it doesn't. I think is what we would say if we're looking at Zelda as kind of a strategy game. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Yeah.
So I think there was some other example I was going to give, and I'm trying to remember what it was. Oh yeah. So one other thing is this is where a lot of times I feel like these neutral systems kind of become apparent when there is like well, I don't know. Do we want to? I think if I start talking about this, I'm going to go into like more of pros and cons of the different things. Did we want to discuss anything else before we started to go into that, or because I can?
Yeah, I got a question about like
Yeah.
neutral ones. So
Sure.
like I'm looking at like Sushi Go. Have you played Sushi Go?
I
Mhm.
have not.
Okay.
Yep.
So yeah, Q Split. So it basically it's a drafting game. It's like very simple. And so you basically pick a piece of sushi, and you get points at the end of the game. And so dumplings, if you draft one dumpling, yeah, those. And if you draft one dumpling, you get 1 point. If you have two dumplings at the end of the game, you get 3 points. If you have three, you get 6, and then it goes 10, 15. So dumplings are like very clearly a like reinforcing loop. The more dumplings you have, the more you want. But if you pick squid nigiri, you just get 3 points. So it feels like squid nigiri would probably be a uh, probably be like potentially like a neutral loop. I'll I'll post a link in the here maybe. I think is like
Sure.
if you can do
Yeah, I
links
can
here
open that
and
up.
Twitch chat. Yeah, this is a
Oh, it's in the Twitch chat.
yeah. I wasn't sure where to post it.
They're all blurry. Oh, here we go.
No, let's scroll down a little bit. Yeah, there you
Squid
go. So
nigiri.
like right, so like dumpling I think is clearly a reinforcing loop, and I guess I would probably say it's fair to say squid nigiri is a neutral.
Yeah, because squid nigiri just gives you 3 straight up. 3 points,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Whereas dumplings give you more points depending on how many you have. So if you have one dumpling, you have 1 point. If you have 2, you have 3. 3, you have 6, and so on. So it's kind of a that's a good example of, I guess you would say. So you're saying that squid nigiri, but I still think squid nigiri is not a neutral because it's probably more neutral, but it's not
Yeah.
neutral because there's still like opportunity costs and all these other things, right?
Yeah, I think it's
it's
like close, but yeah, not 100%.
It's a little bit difficult for me to comment because I think the thing about these is that you kind of need to have like a broad understanding of multiple systems to see how they are impacting
Yes.
valuations.
Sure.
Because like if going to the Hades example, I could pretty easily describe Hades, but you're actually doing all of your abilities on cooldown, and suddenly that system is a lot less reinforcing than it is currently. So I think it's a little bit difficult for me to say about the Sushi Go example. I mean, I would say, if during your action or during your turn, you could get one thing or another, there's some sort of relationship there, probably. So I don't know.
All right. Yeah. So let's talk next about what are some of the good and bad things about these things, maybe. And I know you have a few other things on your list too that we probably want to try to get to. So
I think this will probably be like the meat of like really what hopefully we can get some stuff out of here.
Okay. Yeah.
So I think maybe I'll start with some of my issues with each of these.
Okay. Sure.
And then we can go. So I'll start with neutral because I think that's probably probably one that makes most sense to start with.
Okay.
I think these are very susceptible. Let me find a loop. My notes. So I think one of the biggest issues with neutral loops is they kind of contribute to multiple things. They contribute to solvability. They are more susceptible to imbalance Although that's probably even more so true with reinforcing loops. But with solvability, in terms of if like the only thing that really matters in terms of when an action, you should do an action, is the context, then you can kind of like learn, oh, in this basic context, always
Like a
do this
build order
ability.
sort of thing.
Probably, yeah.
Okay.
So
Or
because
or like chess openings type of thing. Like things you can sort of memorize, right? That like in this situation you can always play the blankety blank because it doesn't have any reinforcing or diversifying effects really. It's just
sure. Oh, okay. One other thing about neutral loops. Neutral loops are like, at a fundamental level, you can't escape them entirely because any decision you make is down to opportunity cost. Like if you have 5 different choices you can make, like you're only going to be making one of those choices, and you're not going to be doing the other thing. Sorry, just ran side tangent. That
Sure.
reminded me of.
Yeah, it's just a question of whether that like extends into the future or not, right?
Sure. Yeah. I think it kind of depends, right? Because like in a lot of ways,
Yeah,
it depends
I think
like how granular.
the whole concept of these loops, that this should maybe be said like as a broader statement that like, and this goes back to that whole state reset question of like the concept of these loops, they can only be as meaningful as there is memory, like state memory. So like if a complete state reset after this action means that there can be none of this, right? There cannot be any reinforcing, there cannot be any diversifying, et cetera, et cetera. So and that also is a gradient. So if there is a little bit of memory, then it can be so and this kind of plays into like arcs, like long arcs, for example. A reinforcing, there's some games where things you do in the early game have like massively important effects on the late game, whereas sometimes it sort of falls off, right? And so a dynamic or like, and a part of the equation for figuring these out would be like how much state memory is there, how much are things sort of soft resetting over time, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
I think I don't know if I would use the example of chess openings. I think maybe that is an example, but I think it maybe gives the wrong idea.
Yeah, I get you.
I think what I'm talking about is less of, in this exact context, do whatever strategy. It's more of in general contexts. There's going to be a lot of different contexts that share enough similarities to some situation where the best option is, or like, I guess maybe the way I describe this is like the right tool versus the wrong tool for the job. Whereas like if you're like not really thinking about the repercussions of using some action, if you're just like looking at the immediate, I don't know if this is the best way to say it, but like if you're kind of like if you're looking at like the immediate thing this is going to do, it's the best tool for the job. Maybe an example to give kind of my point would be like the BFG in Doom. Like in basically any context, it's quote unquote the best tool for the job, but you're not going to use it a bunch because you can't use it a bunch.
Sure.
Essentially, what I'm getting at is when you have these kind of like localized situations that you can solve for, they're easier to solve for because you always know, if I can do A, B, or C, like we're talking about neutral loops, if you can do A, B, or C, like I don't have to keep in mind anything about how that's going to affect the future because it's going to affect it the same one way or another. Does that make any sense? I don't know if I'm describing this well. I feel like I'm probably not.
I'm not sure, but I think when I'm thinking about neutral loops, like I think maybe if you're giving 2 decisions and like one of the decisions gives you $9, one of the decisions gives you $10, but you're not actually sure which one is which, that's like sort of like a kind of neutral decision.
Oh, so you mean like they're
Does that
two
make
face down
sense?
cards or something? And
Yeah, but
one of them will
something
have $9 and one will have 10, or
sort of like that, where you're like neutral decision. They're like just where you're trying to optimize, like trying to just get like maximum value out of like kind of a single decision.
Mhm.
Okay,
And like
sorry, go
y-
on, go on. I just thought of an example though, but go on.
yeah, I was just gonna say like that definitely affects like future game state and future decisions, but it's like you like always want one and never the other. It's just like you're just not sure what you're gonna get, kind of thing. Yeah.
So, I thought of an example in Roller Drome. One thing that kind of like disappointed me was uh, they have different weapons, but they have a like a universal ammo system. So you know you do tricks to like get ammo, but that ammo is shared across all of your different weapons, and
Mhm.
basically each of the different types of enemies more or less has like a specific weakness. It's like, oh, this guy's weak to shotguns. This guy's weak to like grenades. This guy's weak to blah blah blah. Um, so there's kind of like a best solution you're just kind of going for,
Mhm.
and there's like basically no reason ever, unless like I guess you just want to not use the optimal weapon against them because you have a
Mm.
shared ammo pool. It's not like, oh, I'm low on the ammo that's good against this guy, but I'm like have a bunch of ammo on this other action. And like does that kind of get a little bit more of what I'm trying to describe, or or not
Yeah.
really?
I think we all understand. I think the concept of neutral, action loops. I think,
Sure.
yeah, I think what we want to maybe come up with is some. So I personally am of the opinion that you for a strategy game or any game where valuation is the game, you don't want neutral action loops. I think that would be my like therefore statement with all this. I'd be like avoid neutral ones probably. Maybe there
Sure.
are some exceptions. Maybe there are some reasons that you might want a neutral one. Like I guess maybe an advantage of a neutral property advantage would be they're easy to understand, perhaps. But
Yeah, they generally
is
have
that
less
even true?
complexity.
I think like often like in a real-time game, like you kind of do want to test like reflexes and like the player's ability to like recognize patterns in real time. And like so like if you want like it's not like those aren't like strategy game concepts and stuff, but maybe you do want to test like, okay, can you dodge this fireball
Right.
or whatever, like
And dodging as a concept, like attempting to dodge, is not something that that would be a neutral action. You think mostly
yeah, when we're like you just always want to dodge an ability. It's just like whether you
can,
can recognize the ability and dodge it in time, or
right?
or like hit confirming in a fighting game. You like always want to do that. It's just like, are you able to do it, kind of thing, or
Right,
whatever.
like
It's just
dodge.
like that.
They well, actually, this like Dark Souls, right? The dodge roll when you're fighting a boss. That's
Yeah,
there's no that doesn't really change the relative. I mean, it may be a little bit because you are moving your position. So maybe parrying is even better
yeah,
example, right? Because
Yeah.
if you can parry something, it doesn't. Or does it? Well, parrying, I mean, they usually add some kind of effect, like a stun effect or some kind of bonus that you get for parrying. But like,
Sure.
let's say that we had a version of parrying where all it did was negate an incoming attack and nothing else. In that case, that would be a neutral. But interestingly, when we see parrying out in the wild, we do see that they usually give you some kind of like bonus, some kind of like, it stuns the enemy or it slows down time, or, you can do some kind of big combo attack, which, so other things are being
yeah.
valued
I
differently. Yeah.
I think you're right that like in a well, like maybe hitting the button at the right time is like does help make an action game feel better. Like I think you're right that like if you give the player the option of either dodging an attack or parrying an attack, and each has advantages and disadvantages, like that's probably a better game.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. That's kind of what I'm saying. And like I think all designers sort of intuitively understand this, even if they don't have these words, and they're always
Sure.
trying to find ways to make everything in their game not neutral in this way. Like pretty much. Like
Mhm.
there may be some exceptions, but they don't really come easy to me. And honestly, even this advantage, they're easy to understand. I'm not even sure that's true. I like because you could probably have a very easy to understand reinforcing and very easy to understand diversifying things. Like some of our examples that we gave are not hard to understand at all. You know, tribes in an auto battler. Like, yeah, okay, I got 3 undead guys. Get another undead guy. You know what I mean? Like, or like, what was it? The itemization in Diablo. Like, you can have a very simple sword that just gives 100 damage or whatever. And so, yeah, I don't think that there is really an advantage that they're easier to understand. Yeah, I'm on team neutral is kind of just bad, I think.
Fair enough.
For strategy games, anyways.
Yeah,
Or valuation games, perhaps we could say.
So earlier I was talking about how this isn't like some exhaustive list of. I think it kind of gives the impression like there's like a single like one-dimensional spectrum of like, oh, you know, you have the reinforce on one side, you have the diversifying on the other side. I think that's kind of the case, but also I think there's other types of loops as well, ones that I don't really have names for. So like you can have actions that are sort of kind of closer to diversifying loops, but it's more of like I do one action and maybe it makes like a handful of other actions more valuable. Maybe like in the short term or in the long term. So for instance, like there's gonna be lots of examples. Some of them we've already talked about. In another Deep Rock Galactic example is if you are like one of the characters, you can like freeze enemies and then like you can drill them, and like there's like this synergy there because like frozen enemies take more damage for one, but also when you freeze them, you can get close to them without them damaging you. So it's like when you freeze them, you're like making kind of like some subset of actions you can do, at least for like a short period of time, a lot more valuable as opposed to other stuff. So that's like kind of closer to the end of like diversifying loops, but it's more of like a specific type of thing. And then you know you can have like weird like, oh, I do A which helps B and then B helps C and then C helps D and maybe D helps A, and like you could have like some like circle loop thing going on, or maybe not. Maybe it's like some weird other thing. It's just like some kind of like
I think that in a complicated games like that, you do want a lot of that, and often games do give you lots of different ways in which things are
sure
affect each other or coupled or all that. And
yeah, I think this is definitely pretty common, and like I don't have a lot to say about it yet. I have more to say about the other things, but yeah,
I'll just add that in practice, in a game, in a real game, any given thing, even our simple sword, probably has some reinforcing effects and some diversifying effects.
Sure.
It's going to be like kind of a little bit messy, and that's a good thing. We're sort of trying to simplify it and abstractify it just so just for game design, theory purposes. But in practice, it's going to be a lot messier, and that's usually a good thing.
Yeah, I'd agree.
So you said you had some more to add?
Me or
yeah, you,
Priest?
yeah.
I don't know if I did.
Okay.
I forgot.
Yeah. Okay.
So did you want to move on to some? So we talked about.
Let's move on.
Did you want to talk about reinforcing or diversifying ones first?
We can talk about reinforcing.
Okay. Yeah. So I think one of the main challenges that these face on their own is that they kind of have probably a bit of the issue where, well, I think it's a little bit different. I think the biggest issue with them is that at a certain point, like once you're kind of on a certain path, it kind of makes a lot of decisions like non-decisions where it's just like obvious which is best. So I think this is kind of the case with Hades, where at a certain point it's just like, okay, this time on this run I'm going for like the whatever attack is going to be like super powerful. So anytime I get like a choice between these things and like that comes up, it's like, okay, well, I'm I'm just gonna buff the thing that's already strong.
Sure.
So
Yep.
I think there's ways that games have kind of addressed this in various ways. I think one thing that's kind of I saw recently that was interesting is in Daybreak, where you're kind of like building up these like building up like an engine of the different types of tags on like these. Let me try to explain it for anyone who's like not familiar with it. Essentially, you have like a tableau of these different cards, but you're like upgrading them by like sacrificing cards almost. But then in doing so, it's like making any cards you play there kind of stronger in a way. But then the thing is like you can kind of like pivot later on if you want, because you can like replace the card that's on top to do something else. So there's definitely ways this can be addressed, but like I think this is one of the concerns you have to be aware of when you have these reinforcing loops, where at a certain point it's like you're kind of like locked in. It's just like, oh, I'm just going to do the thing again and again.
Sure. Yep.
So.
And I would also add just snowballing balance concerns might be a concern for reinforcing effects, right? Because
yeah, kind of.
It's like you already have a certain good thing and then you're getting more of that. And so there's just inherently something to keep an eye on. Snowballing, if it would happen, it would be something to do with this.
Yeah. So I think like in general, reinforcing loops are probably a lot more okay in single player games. Like in multiplayer games, yeah, they do like the snowballing can be a big problem. I think snowballing sometimes is useful in multiplayer games. Like once a player gets like pretty far ahead, you kind of want the game to snowball to an end state very quickly, so there's no like lame duck situation.
Sure.
But you don't want that happening like near the beginning of the game.
Yeah, I'm just gonna write bad snowballing, just to be very clear. Because I agree,
Yeah.
like I would say what you're saying is like I would just call those like long arcs. Like to me, snowball means like it evokes it sort of has a connotation, a negative connotation, and it means like bad long arcs, like long arcs that are too strong, or lame duck maybe even would be a better way to put it.
Yeah. I'm a little bit skeptical. Well, maybe not skeptical. I'm maybe a little bit hesitant to say that they're bad in multiplayer. I think they definitely can be, but also
if they're too much,
I think it depends. Like it depends a lot on the context. That's the that's the crux of it. I think for me is
yeah,
because in certain ways, if maybe your opponent has started to like go down a specific way of trying to beat you, and like basically you can kind of see, oh, they're doing all this stuff to like reinforce this specific way to attack you or to win the game, then maybe you can kind of use that as a way to like, okay, well, they're kind of committed to this now, so now I'm going to like kind of focus on countering that specific thing. So I think it depends a lot on the context is all.
I think that's a scenario where like you kind of don't want players doing that though. Like because like then it's a scenario where like, okay, the player who's really committed will either like that takes over the game and they win, or they get like kind of completely countered and lose, and there's not very much like counter, like there's not really like this like a strategy dance kind of thing that like you really want. It's more just like very binary, like, oh, did they get countered or not, and like it's kind of like very like linear.
Well, yeah, I mean, what you're describing kind of reminds me of the kind of a lot of the issues about like with like StarCraft or whatever, where if you have two players that are just committing to one corner of the triangle, and they just happen to,
right,
like one person will just kind of happen to win. I don't know. I'm hesitant to kind of say avoid this in multiplayer. I think
I don't think Eli's saying that.
Is more like yeah.
It can like there can be like ships passing in the night situations where like I'm trying to go all in on one thing, you're trying to go all in on another, and it's just like they're not really interactive. Like usually like in multiplayer games, like players interacting with each other are like the points where the games are the most fun, and often like these things can like if you're just both players are committing to one path, it can be very uninteractive sometimes.
So one of the
Sure.
positive things that I would write about reinforcing action loops, it would be that it kind of creates a boldness.
Yep.
Right, like you know, where diversifying, I expect one of the maybe challenges that it might have is that, and I see this sometimes in like Euro games where everything is like so balanced, and every time you take an action, like all the other actions get better, you know, like in a very overt kind of way. Like I think Euro games are very about like that diversifying sort of value,
Sure.
maybe to a fault sometimes. Whereas yeah, like reinforcing a reinforced action can be very bold and can be very like exciting and clear and really change the game state in a bold way.
So let me
Right?
try to kind of state what you said in the way that I understood it, and correct me if I'm wrong,
Sure.
because I could be totally off, right?
Yeah.
I do think this is one of the things that's kind of like important to note about one of the biggest differences between diversifying and reinforcing loops is that with reinforcing, there might be like a lot of different paths, so to speak, that you could take with reinforcing. And it kind of like maybe at the beginning, it's like you're not really sure which path you're going to take, but then as it progresses, it becomes more clear. Like, okay, maybe I'm going to take one of these two paths, and then it's like, okay, like once you're kind of near the end, it's like, okay, I'm on this one path. And I think one of the things that kind of creates is that each time, you know, you can play the game multiple times, and then you have like almost like very different experiences in a sense, where like, oh, you know, this time I did this strategy, and like this other time I did this other strategy. Whereas with diversifying loops, one of the things that I think can be a detriment of them is that, you know, each time you play, it's kind of like they can kind of feel
Samey.
like they're doing the same thing almost.
Yeah.
Because like, oh, you know, every game I played like, you know, 30% attack cards, 30% defense cards, 30% econ cards.
Sure.
Um,
Multicolored
so
good stuff. That sometimes you know, that sometimes
Yeah.
something that can happen in like deck builder games is that
sure.
you end
Or,
up
like,
with just a deck
sleepiness.
full of like a rainbow of good cards that don't really have a strong identity, right?
Sure. Is that kind of what you were going with, like bold, or did you mean something else?
Yes, that is what I meant. Yeah, that
Okay.
blurriness and that every game, yeah, actually creates a boldness in the design, creates a boldness in the match. An identity rather, an identity for the match, right? Maybe for the match. Like you went hard, you know, you got like 8 battle cruisers or something. Like, you know,
Sure.
like there was some really big, bold thing that it almost like creates a story out of the thing.
Yeah, I was about to say that. I think.
Whereas the
it's like,
diversified, a very heavily diversified story can be very hard to tell a story about. And actually, I think this is interesting because some of my games, I think Oro is a game that's sort of hard to tell a story about. And part of that is because it is a very diversified system in a lot of ways.
yeah.
Yeah, I'd agree with all that. Just another thing I'd point out is that often in team games, players will have like very specific roles in a team, and that can be really fun.
Yeah.
True. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess.
One more thing.
Yeah.
Also, just like I would say, like Balatro is a game where it's like they're very reinforcing. Like you kind of just like, okay, I'm just going really hard on flushes, and as we were saying, like the reinforcing loops often do create snowballing, and that's what that game is about. The blinds increase exponentially, and your job is to create an exponential snowball to keep up with the blinds, and that's just pretty fun to do that.
Yeah.
I think that it definitely makes sense that a lot of it's pretty common for roguelikes to you know, I don't think this was really, I don't know how much of this was really intentionally thought about versus just kind of like stumbled into, but I do think it's not really a surprise that a lot of roguelikes kind of have at least some level of the reinforcing loops because of if you don't have that, then I do think that's when you start having it be like, oh, you know, I played it a few times, but like it kind of feels the same every time, right?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, and there's not a huge drawback to giving a player, runaway game state or whatever, right?
Yeah,
Like,
that's the less of an issue in
It
a single
depends.
player game.
Well, it depends though. It depends on the length of the match and stuff. Like I've definitely played. I don't know. This is it's kind of a weird example, but like Fire Emblem Three Houses. That game had a real like lame duck
Right.
snowball problem where I fell off of it mid game because my main character was just so godly that and that has to do with reinforced loops, and he just, I mean, maybe you could just say this is just a balance or tuning issue and not to do with reinforcing, but
Yeah.
I don't know, there's something there, and that's what we want to avoid, is that like lame duck feeling. Snowballs can
Yeah,
be
for sure.
cool, but if you feel like I'm never gonna die, I'm never gonna lose, this is all just cleanup, then that's a problem. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's what I was saying. It's how it's like it works with roguelikes, right? Because like I feel like in that game you were talking about, like it goes on. Yeah, it goes on for a long time. You play multiple battles with the same people, but with the roguelike, it just ends and you start a new run, right?
Right. Yeah, so this maybe is not, I don't know if this is, I mean, like I said, like part of the function of action loops and understanding these is how much memory is there and how much like state memory is there and stuff. And so that has to do with the relative length of the whole match, right? So if the whole thing is a 30-hour campaign like Fire Emblem, that's a really different animal than if it's a 30-minute or 20-minute or 10-minute like traditional roguelike session. So
Sure.
those, we have to keep those in mind with respect to these as well, I think.
Yeah. All right. Did we want to move on to reinforcing loops
Diversifying?
Oh yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Diversifying.
Yeah, sure. I already wrote, because we sort of were, as we were talking about reinforcing, we sort of mentioned diversifying. So I already wrote that diversifying has the challenge of sort of being samey or blurry, which I think is true of some Euro games, and I would even say of Oro as well sometimes. But
Sure.
So let's talk about what are some positives or other challenges for diversifying.
Yeah, so I think I talked a little bit about some of the challenges. I think another challenge I would add is that in the same way that on the one extreme, the reinforcing loops can make decisions kind of meaningless, diversifying can also kind of do that. I think the extreme of that would be a lot of cases with like cooldowns, where you have like a bunch of abilities and they each have like a very short cooldown, and then you're just kind of like spamming them as soon as they become available. And like at this point, like there's just been a lot of games that just, you like cut out the middleman and just remove the user even like pushing a button, just to make it automatically trigger, right? Because it's like it doesn't really matter.
Well, yeah, that's, I mean, you could make it like a fully diversified action, like if we could imagine that, would make it that your choices never matter, kind of, right? Because no matter what you pick, it's sort of like the state sort of stays the same in a way, or like, everything else gets better, so just pick whatever and then pick anything else. And I don't know, there could be a way in which it makes things meaningless, I guess, in the way you're saying, I think.
Sure. Yeah. So I think that, and the sense that like in the extreme, it can kind of hurt a lot of like the meaning of why you're doing anything, and then also the sense that you're kind of playing the same game again and again. Like there's not really much difference. I think those are probably the two main. Well, actually, one other thing is that, well, it depends. Like one other thing is that with certain implementations, it can add a lot more overhead to just like amount of information complexity there is. But I think that's more of a minor thing. It really depends on the context. It's kind of hard to say, because certain, as we kind of talked about earlier, like certain systems are going to like be easier to understand or just like keep track of in your head than others. Like if you have, like I'll give an example of something that would probably be more difficult to keep track of in your head. Like say you had a bunch of abilities in an action game, like in a fast-paced action game. Like, oh, you can only move, like your move left, move right, move up, move down. They are all they're like a diversifying loop. So you kind of like staying in the same-ish area or whatever. Like maybe that's kind of interesting on like some systemic level, and maybe it kind of in some weird way works in like a turn-based game, but like in a fast-paced game, like keeping track of like, oh, can I move left or right or
True.
whatever? It's just gonna be like, yeah, it's just gonna probably be too much information to keep track of.
Yeah, that's a good point. In certain contexts.
Sure. So yeah, I think those are some of the main issues. I think in terms of strengths, I think one of the most interesting parts of diversifying loops to me is that, and I've tried to like talk more about this at some other point, but like I kind of like view the like there's an idea that I call for now like the latent strategy space, which is basically like there's a lot of strategies that might be interesting in some capacity, just in terms of like understanding how they work, but they are just not. There's like no good reason to do them. And I think that one of the things that's nice about diversifying loops is that they tend to help explore at least some more of that space.
Yeah.
Because
encourages, like, that.
Yeah, because then and I think that's good because you're increasing, like on one hand, if there's some specific context that comes up a lot, like yeah, okay, it's cool if you kind of figure out of your options like what is the best tool for the job, but sometimes it's cool to have like, okay, well I can't use my best tool for the job, how I'm going to address this problem with the other tools that aren't really best suited for this.
In some sense, you could say that's sort of the essence of games is like, I don't have the best tool for the job. How do I get the job done with the second best tool or this weird shape? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think maybe a really good example of kind of like what I'm getting at is like there's a lot of videos on YouTube about like people playing like stealth games, but like doing it in like these like somewhat speedrunner-esque sort of things, but also just like using like all the tools they have. And then you compare that to people actually playing the game, and it's just like someone like out on like some sniper post, just like sniping all the enemies, and they're all dead, and they just like walk in, and like there's no challenge.
Sure.
I think that's kind of what I'm getting at with that. So yeah, I don't know if either of you had any notes about other things about diversifying loops.
I would. You want to go first?
Yeah. Just that, like, often, it's nice, like, sometimes to be able to choose between, like, a lot of things that you want. Like, so, like, if you have a game with a reinforcing loop, like, you kind of railroaded down one path.
Sure.
And with reinforcing, like, so it's like if I'm playing Diablo and all I want is crit damage, then I look at the shop and I look at like all 200 items in the shop. I'm like, nope. So like if I'm like diversifying, I'm like, I look at everything. I'm like, oh, I want everything, and I have to like pick the one thing out of everything that I want. And I think that can be a more interesting decision.
But also could be overwhelming, right?
Yeah, it can be overwhelming as well.
Yeah.
So it's just like you kind of want like a little.
Yeah. It probably has more to do with like if a shop has 200 items.
Well,
yeah,
it's just sort of maybe for example, maybe a 10 items. I don't know.
Sure, no, I get what you mean though. Yeah, for sure. I think that's the issue I was kind of getting at with like Hades is it's just like, okay, does this boost my thing that I want to boost or not?
Yeah, I think it's good design is sort of bouncing back and forth between these reinforcing and diversifying, understanding like that, like I think the overwhelming point is a really important one. And like, cause I think that there is at least maybe this is just me, but like when I first got into game design, I very much I would say like I almost like fetishized the diversifying thing, right? Because I wanted exploration of a wider band of the potential strategy space, and a lot of video games, like a lot of like especially commercial video games, don't do that. Like there's all this sort of wasted space that doesn't really get used, and that's because things are too reinforced a lot of the time. So I think that it's easy when we're getting into game design to really think of the diversifying as like the be all end all and the goal and the best way to design games. But the reinforcing has real positives, and when we think about something like a big item shop or something, and how it can be very overwhelming if actually I do need to consider every single thing And being able to not consider a bunch of options is extremely valuable for players. Like players being able to say like, oh, I'm not even going to look at all these things. That's really important. And so I think that there's going to be always a careful, thoughtful bouncing back and forth between the reinforcing and the diversifying in any design, probably.
Sure.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's kind of like menu design, right? Like you're like, I know I want pasta, and then you look at the menu and like, okay, there's 3 pastas. Now I gotta choose between the carbonara or the spaghetti.
Right. Absolutely. Yes. Yeah, exactly. It's a lot of games is about like how do we present information, to players in a way that will be satisfying for them, but also will be interesting, right? Like balancing, and that's kind of what this is. Like the reinforcing is like the satisfying, and the diversifying is like the interesting. And if things get too interesting, then we're like, oh, I don't want to. Oh my God, like I don't want to choose all these things. And if they get too satisfying, where we're just like, yeah, okay. I mean, I guess I'll have the hamburger, or whatever, because that's what there is. And so there's a balance to be struck there, I guess.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah, I'm really excited to see like I want to see like more games that kind of do some more interesting stuff where there's these two things conflicting, really, because I think they're both valuable in different ways, and I think to a large degree they can kind of, I suspect that they can help like nullify each other's weaknesses to some degree. That I might be wrong about that.
No, you're totally
that's
right.
Kind of the impression I get.
Absolutely. Yeah, they're two ends of this pole, and if something is too reinforcing, then you might want to add some diversifying. And if something is too diversified, you might want to add some reinforcing, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think maybe let's like try to wrap up in the next like 5-10 minutes or so. So are there any last topics you want to get into?
You need to look at chat. I don't know if chat has any questions. I mean,
Hellfire BM said, I think in Bullet Heaven / Vampire Survivor games, it feels good to max out your weapons and getting the giant evolve, seeing how much damage you stacked. Yeah, absolutely. That's kind of one of the main values. That's kind of what we talk about with boldness, right? And memorableness and all that kind of stuff. That's one of the nice things about reinforcing values, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if I have any other notes of what to discuss. So
you can be just kind of reinforcing with a reinforcing loop. You can be like exploring like kind of the edges of the strategy space, if that makes sense. Where it's like with diversifying, you're kind of exploring the middle, if that analogy works.
Oh, I see. Yeah, like you're becoming a big spiky shape with reinforcing, and so you're getting way far out into one direction, right? Whereas diversifying, you're actually covering all the little spots in the middle, right?
Yeah, and earlier I was actually, when I was trying to figure out like a name, I was actually thinking about like wide and narrow. But I was like, that's a little bit abstract, but I think it kind of gets the point across.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So
cool. Well, any last thoughts from either of you?
I don't think I have anything.
All right, cool. Well, this was really good. I think we got this down. I'll post this as into the Discord so people can take a look at these notes. But yeah, this is fun. Let's do another one of these in a week or so. And
cool.
Yeah, thanks for coming by, both of you.
Yeah, that was good.
All righty. See you guys.
Good day. See you.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, so yeah, that was the thing. What's going on here? I want to leave this channel. Disconnect. There we go. Cool, that worked really well. Yeah, thanks for coming by, y'all. I'm gonna stop streaming now, but I'm gonna come back. That's weird. There. I'm going to come back in a little while, I think, and do some more streaming. I got to do a bunch of Spellstorm stuff today. That's not really stream worthy, but yeah, I'm going to post this and I'll see you guys very soon. So I'll be back today at some point. Catch y'all later.